Rome versus Persia, 363 AD, the Battle of Ctesiphon, and the Emperor who never returned. This is the story of Julian's march into the lion's den, a victory so close to the Persian capital that Roman soldiers could see its towers glittering across the Tigris, yet still it became a road to death. Picture the late spring heat of Mesopotamia. The Euphrates behind you, the Tigris ahead, and between them a ribbon of dust kicked up by tens of thousands of Roman boots. Along the river crawls a fleet of more than 1,000 ships, heavy with grain, siege engines, and the quiet arrogance of an empire that believes the world should bend to its will. Julian is only 31, already a legend in his own mind, philosopher, reformer, warrior. He has come to Persia for one prize, Ctesiphon, the jewel of Shapur II. On the 29th of May 363 he will smash a Persian field army outside those walls, losing astonishingly few men in the clash. But here is the question that haunts every step forward. Why does a battle won at the gates of an enemy capital become the beginning of a nightmare? The answer waits on the far bank of the Tigris, and in a decision Julian has not yet made. Julian marched east with a mind full of ghosts. He knew their names: Crassus, whose legions vanished in the sands at Carrhae; Mark Antony, bruised and bleeding on the long road out; even Trajan, who took Ctesiphon once, only to watch the prize slip away when Rome turned her gaze elsewhere. The East had always been Rome's mirror and her warning. You could conquer it, yes, but you could also be swallowed by it. Julian did not come to be a warning. He came to be a legend. In Rome, they called him Emperor. In armor, among the campfires, they called him Commander. In the temples he reopened, the priests whispered another title, restorer of the old gods. Julian had grown up in the shadow of a Christian court, a young survivor of purges, taught to smile while knives were still wet in his family's blood. He learned early that power was fragile, that the world could change its faith, its loyalties, its story, in a single generation. So when he finally held the purple, he held it like a man who might lose it tomorrow. He was not a large man, not a thunderous Caesar carved from marble. He was lean, sharp-eyed, bearded, like a philosopher from Athens, with the restless energy of someone who reads too much and sleeps too little. At night he argued doctrine with priests and generals alike. In the morning he drilled with soldiers, ate their rough bread, and walked among them without a crown, as if the distance between emperor and legionary could be crossed by will alone. Yet, even as he tried to be loved, he needed to be feared. He needed a victory that no senator, no bishop, no rival could ignore. Persia was that victory. The Sasanian Empire under Shapur II was not a fading kingdom waiting for Rome's boot. It was the other great power of the world, rich, disciplined, confident, and ancient in its own right. The frontier cities had traded hands for a century. Fortresses had been lost and regained, not by speeches but by blood. Julian saw the war not as a border quarrel, but as a duel between equals. If he could carve open Persia's heart, he would not only secure Rome's east, he would prove that the gods of his ancestors still breathed through Roman steel. In March 363, he gathered an army that seemed built for myth. Veterans from Gaul who had followed him across the Rhine, heavy infantry in iron scales and mail, cavalry with plumed helmets and long lances, engineers, archers, slingers, physician crews, and a river fleet that crawled beside them like a mobile city. The sources speak of an immense force, addued by Armenian allies and guided by deserters and scouts who knew Thor of lands. The plan was a blade with two edges. Julian would drive south along the Euphrates with the main army and fleet, cutting through Assyria toward Ctesiphon. Another Roman force under Procopius and Sebastinus would move through Armenia from the north, pulling Persian attention away and ready to close like a vice. If both jaws met, Shapur would be forced to fight or watch his capital fall. It was bold, clean, and like all clean plans, it depended on time behaving. At Ctesiphon, where the Euphrates meets the Kaba, Julian stood before his troops and spoke the language of destiny. The river wind snapped their standards above him. Men listened with the silence of those who have already decided they will follow, even if the road ends in smoke. He promised them plunder of Persia's storehouses, vengeance for old humiliations, and glory of a kind Rome had not tasted in generations. Then he gave them some burial, heavy coins that clinked in calloused, palms and the army roared as one body. The march began. Early spring in Mesopotamia can be gentle for a heartbeat, but even then the land tests you. Outside the riverbanks, the earth opens into flat, hard plains, and beyond them, waste. The army moved in long columns, banners drifting like islands in a sea of dust. By day the sun climbed higher and higher, a white disk that burned color from the world. By night the sky cracked open with stars, and the Tigris and Euphrates breathed cool mist over the camps. The men told stories under their shields. Some prayed to Christ, others to Mars, some, quietly, to any god who would listen. Julian tolerated the Christian prayers, but he did not love them. He had tried to pull Rome back toward her older gods, not through persecution, but through a kind of stubborn theatrical faith. He ordered sacrifices before major movements. He watched the smoke for omens. He asked the priests if the liver of the bull looked healthy, if the flame rose straight, if the birds flew the right way. To solve his raise on superstition and discipline alike, the rituals were not decoration, they were weapons for morale. If the gods marched with you, your heart marched harder, and at first, the gods answered. Persian border forts fell in sequence, snapped off the map like dead branches. The Romans took Sabora after a stubborn siege, then Zamolka, cracking its defenses with tunnels and sudden night assaults. Stores of grain and wine were seized. Prisoners were paraded through camp. The fleet swelled with captured goods. Everywhere the legions went, the smoke of Persian villages rose behind them. The campaign felt unstoppable. But Shapur did not rush to meet them. That was the first. Shadow Persian scouts appeared at distance, riding small, hard horses that seemed carved for speed. They watched from ridgelines, then vanished. Like cavalry, darted toward the Roman flanks, loosing arrows and retreating before the infantry could form. Peasants fled ahead of the Romans, driving their livestock eastward, leaving empty wells and scorched granaries behind them. The deeper Julian went, the less the land offered. It was as if Persia itself was pulling back its skin, refusing to be fed to Rome. Some generals urged caution. The old veterans knew this game. A patient enemy could starve a conqueror without ever risking a pitched battle. Julian heard them and still pressed on, because every day he advanced the dream grew larger in his mind. Ctesiphon was no longer a city to take. It was the hinge of history. If he took it, he could dictate peace on the ruins of Shapur's throne. He could march home not as a controversial reformer, but as the man who did what Trajan had only tasted. And if the gods were with him, what right had he to stop? Late May, the army reached the canal zones, where the Euphrates and Tigris ran close enough to touch through man-made waterways. Here, the land became greener, but also more treacherous. Marshy patches, red beds high as a man's chest, and dikes that could funnel an army into narrow killing grounds. Julian's engineers worked constantly, cutting channels, building crossings, keeping the fleet aligned with the marching columns. The army's heartbeat was logistics now. Bread, water, fodder, arrows, repair of armor, tending of horses. Victory was not yet a battle. Victory was making sure the army could still fight when the battle arrived. Then, at last, Persia showed her teeth. Across the Tigris, beyond a wide sweep of flat ground, rose Ctesiphon, twin cities Seleucia and the Persian capital Spren, along the river like a crown of brick and stone. Towers pierced the haze. Walls ran in long, unbroken lines. Inside lay palaces, arsenals, and the prestige of the Sasanian dynasty. It was close enough that Roman soldiers could smell cooking fires from the far bank when the wind shifted. In front of those walls waited a Persian field army, not the full weight of Shapur's host, but enough to matter. Cavalry glittering with lamellar armor, archers by the thousands, war elephants towering behind the ranks, their heads dressed in iron and colored cloth, each step a slow earthquake. Their commanders held positions that guarded the crossing points, hoping to break Julian's assault at the water's edge. The Romans stared across the river, and something in the air changed. This was the moment every soldier dreams of and fears, the end of marching, the moment the horizon stops being a promise and becomes a war. Men checked straps on helmets. They ran fingers along sword edges. They swallowed hard, and tried not to show it. Julian did not sleep that night. He walked the bank, listening to the water, watching the Persian fires flicker like a second sky on the far shore. He knew he had come too far to turn away. He also knew that to cross here, under an enemy's eyes, was to risk everything in a single throw. Above him, The standards stirred in the night wind. Somewhere behind those walls, Shapa waited. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the northern Roman force was supposed to be moving, drawing Persian attention away. Julian needed that other jaw to close. He needed the gods to keep smiling. He needed time to stay obedient. He looked across the Tigris, and in his heart a question rose that he would never speak aloud. If I win here, will it be enough? Because even before the first horn sounded, the campaign had already begun to demand a price. Not in blood yet, but in distance, in thirst, in the silent fact that to reach this place, he had stretched the Roman army like a rope behind him longer and longer, until one cut could snap it. Ctesiphon at the river's edge dawn came up pale and already hot, a thin veil of light over the Tigris. The river looked calm from a distance, almost merciful, but Julian knew better. A river beside an enemy capital is never water alone. It is a moat, a wall, a test that judges the brave and the foolish with the same cold current. Across the far bank, the Persians had woken too. Their line was long and bright, armor catching the sunrise like scattered coins. Cavalry in ranks that seemed to go on forever, bows held high, ready to turn the air into a storm, and behind them, heavier shapes that moved like hills, elephants, each one draped in leather and iron, each one a walking tower for archers. The Roman soldiers watched in silence. Some had never seen elephants in war. The memory of Hannibal still lived in Rome's bones. An old fear has a way of teaching new men. Julian stood with his commanders at a bend where the current widened. The scouts spoke fast. The priests spoke slower, weighing yesterday's omens. The generals argued like men who felt the noose of distance. There were safe crossings upriver, they said. There were safer crossings downriver, but safer meant time, and time belonged to Shapur. The longer the Romans waited, the more Persia could gather, the more the land could be emptied, the more the army's belly could turn against its courage. Julian listened, eyes narrowed at the far shore. He had always gone where risk burned hottest. That habit had carried him to power. Today it might carry his army into a grave. He made his choice before the sun climbed fully clear. They would cross here. It would strike before fear could settle. The fleet would be used not to lurk behind the river, but to break it. When their order moved through camp, it moved like a spark along dry grass. Boats were hauled down, their hulls scraping on the pebbled bank. The strongest swimmers among the auxilia stepped forward first, tying ropes across their chests. Legionaries stripped down, rolling their tunics tight above their knees, gripping shields and pila as if the river could be stabbed through by will. The engineers checked knots and lashings in quick, nervous motions. No trumpet called the start. Julian wanted surprise, not ceremony. The first boat slid out with a soft slap of water. The river swallowed their oars and pulled at their sides. For a heartbeat, the Persians did not react as if they were waiting to be certain that Rome was truly daring this. Then the far bank erupted. Arrows rose in black clouds. They hissed down and thudded into wood and flesh. Some boats shivered, rocked, turned half sideways. Men shouted, drowned out by the river's roar. A boat to the left took a volley and sagged low, men scrambling to keep it afloat. Another drifted offline, swept by current, its rowers fighting like desperate ants against a flood. Julian did not flinch. He climbed into a boat himself, refusing armor to move faster, refusing the thought of death to keep his face steady. The men around him saw it, and their fear stiffened into something else. An emperor who rose beside you is an emperor you do not leave behind. The Roman archers on the near bank answered, loosing into the Persian ranks. Scorpions mounted on the fleet spat bolts that punched holes through shields and saddles. The river became a corridor of screaming iron. The Persians tried to push down to the shoreline, but their commanders held them back, not wanting to break their line too early. Then the first Roman boat struck the far mud. Auxiliaries leaped out, water to their chests, shields up. They waded forward under arrow fire, planting their feet in slick river silt. The Persians surged to meet them. Cavalry tried to ride down into the shallows, hooves splashing, riders leaning low with spears. One horse toppled, dragged by the current, and its rider vanished under the press, but more came behind him. The far bank became a wet, cramped killing ground. The Romans formed faster than the Persians expected. Shield edges locked. The first pila flew, heavy and true, punching through lacquered armor and sending riders tumbling. A Persian cavalry charge broke against that wall like a wave against stone. On both sides, the men began to die in piles that the river tried to steal. More boats landed, more legionaries spilled out, their discipline surviving the chaos of crossing. With every moment, the Roman bridgehead grew thicker, deeper, harder to uproot. Julian saw a gap in the Persian line, a slight sag where the enemy had overextended. Near the water, he pointed with his sword, shouted an order, and Roman cohorts shoved forward like a door slammed open. The Persians pulled back, not defeated yet, but startled. They had expected a slow crossing. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they had been hit by the full weight of Rome. At the moment, Rome was still half drowned. Now the battle widened into open ground. Roman infantry advanced in steady steps, shields high, glady ready. The dust rose. The sun climbed. Persian archers rained arrows, but the Roman line kept shape, swallowing losses and moving forward anyway. Julian rode along the front on a small horse, calling individuals by name when he could, praising one unit, scolding another, forcing the army to remember that it was being watched by a man who would not accept retreat. The Persians answered with their greatest threat. The elephants moved. At first they seemed slow, reluctant to join the human frenzy, but once they began, the earth visibly changed. Each step pressed dust into clouds. Their tusks wore metal caps. Their drivers shouted, stabbing with hooks to keep them straight. Towers on their backs swayed, packed with archers who loosed downward into Roman faces when the elephants hit the Roman line. Fear tried to climb into the men's throats. A single elephant can make a disciplined soldier feel small. A line of them can make an army feel like prey. One beast shoved into a cohort, shields splintering, men tossed aside as if they were reds. Another lifted a soldier on its tusk and flung him back behind the ranks. The Persian cavalry surged. In the wake of that panic, hoping to crack the Roman wall wide enough to flood through, Julian saw the danger. He did not order retreat. He ordered fire. Bundles of straw and pitch were brought up by the rear. The Romans had learned this trick centuries earlier. They hurled burning torches at the elephants' faces. They jabbed upward with spears. They screamed and banged shields and made the battlefield sound like the edge of the world. The elephants hated fire, their eyes rolled. The trumpeting cut through every human voice. One turned sideways, smashing into Persian cavalry instead of Romans. Another reared, shaking off its tower, and then ran blind, crushing whatever stood in its path. The Persians tried to regain control, but a panicked elephant cannot be commanded. It is a god of chaos. The line that had been meant to break Rome became a weapon against Persia. In the confusion, Julian drove his infantry onward. The legions pushed through dust and blood, stabbing into disordered cavalry, taking ground with that relentless Roman logic: step, lock, strike, step again. Persian nobles fought hard, but their cohesion frayed. By noon, their field army was buckling back toward the safety of the walls. And then, suddenly, it was over. The Persians pulled behind the fortified approaches to Ctesiphon. The Romans stood in the open plain, breathing hard, drenched in sweat and river water, stunned by the speed of their own victory. The battlefield was a mess of shattered towers, dead horses, and bodies pressed into the trampled earth. The Tigris ran past, carrying arrows, shields, and the quiet proof of what had just happened. Julian rode out among the wounded. His face was bright with heat and something close to awe. He had won the fight that should have broken him. He had done it in front of the capital of his greatest enemy. The soldiers cheered when he passed, not because they were safe, but because, for a few hours, they had felt invincible. Yet, when the shouting faded, a colder reality stepped forward. Ctesiphon still stood. The walls rose untouched. The gates remained shut. Persian banners still hung above the towers, and the city's defenders were fresh, deep, and protected by stone and moat. Julian's engineers studied the defenses and found what they dreaded. The fleet had brought siege tools, yes, but not enough for a city like this. Not enough for a capital that had prepared for Rome across generations. To storm those walls without heavy engines would be suicide. To sit and build engines would be to invite Shapur's main army to arrive and choke. Then between river and rampart, in his tent that evening, Julian called his war council. The air inside was thick with sweat, dust, and the smell of blood that no washing could remove. The men looked at maps. They looked at each other. They looked at their emperor. One voice urged siege anyway, claiming the city might crack under pressure. Another urged withdrawal to safer ground, saying that a victory outside the walls was already enough to force terms. A third spoke of waiting for the northern army, trusting the plan's second jaw to close. Julian listened. His hands were steady, but his eyes were not. Victory had opened the door to a greater hunger. He had come for Ctesiphon, and now he was staring at it, close enough to touch in his mind, still unreachable in his hands. A messenger entered with news. Persian riders had been sighted to the east, not scattered scouts now, but organized columns. Shapur was moving. The main host was coming. The fire on the river the next morning. The Romans worked to a smell they did not understand at first. It was not the ordinary stink of camp sweat, leather smoke from cooking fires, the sour rot of yesterday's blood. This was sharper, greasier. It carried on the wind from the river like a threat. Men stepped out of tents and saw. The fleet torchlight moved among the ships. Shadows of sailors and engineers cut across decks. And then the first plume of smoke curled upward, black against the pale sky. A murmur rolled through the ranks, the kind that begins as confusion and turns quickly into fear when no one can stop it. Julian had given the order in the dark. After the council ended, no herald to explain, no speech to soften the blow. Just action. They were burning their own road home. One ship caught fully, fire racing along its tarred planks. Another followed, then another. Soon the Tigris bank looked like a funeral procession for an empire. 1,000 hulls, heavy with grain, arms, and siege engines, were swallowed by flame. The heat struck faces even from the far side of camp. Spars collapsed with cracking sounds like bones breaking. Men who had crossed half the world beside those ships stood frozen, watching their lifeline turn to Ashdod. A centurion near the front spat into the dust. "So we live on air now," he muttered, not loudly enough to be treason, but loud enough to be heard. Julian did not look at the fleet as it died. He mounted his horse early, dressed plain, with no crown. He rode through the ranks as if nothing had changed, as if this was merely another morning march. But his soldiers were not fools. They understood the language of fire. With the ships gone, there was no easy retreat downriver, no floating granary, no slow, safe withdrawal behind a wall of water. There was only the land ahead, Persian land, and the land behind, already stripped and watching them like a trap waiting to close. Some men cheered anyway. They told themselves this was courage, that their emperor had cut off weakness so they could not doubt. But others were silent, their thoughts heavy as wet cloaks. They had seen commanders do this before, men who fear a retreat more than a disaster, and they knew that if fate turned against them, those flames would be remembered as the moment Rome gambled too far. The army moved out from the river line by mid-morning. Dust rose in thick sheets. The sun hammered down without pity.
Julian drove
them northeast, aiming to meet the northern force or to force Shapur into battle on ground of his choosing. That was the story told aloud. The story whispered in tired mouths was simpler. We are marching into a land that wants us dead. Persia answered the march, the way Julian should have expected silence first. Then hunger. The villages they reached were empty. Doors swung open on dry hinges. Courtyards held nothing but ash and chicken feathers. Wells had been filled with stones or poisoned with carrion, and the granaries were black shells. Even the date palms were hacked down, their sweet fruit left to rot in heat that smelled like vinegar. The Romans ate what they could scavenge. A handful of scorched barley here, a goat too slow to flee there. But men cannot march on scraps, not when each day burns their water and strength away. The army's wagons grew lighter, the mules began to weaken. Horses sucked the last moisture from cracked tongue and gum. Still, Julian pressed on. By the third day inland, the Persians began to speak more clearly, not with a battle line, not with a heroic charge. With arrows in the twilight, they came like ghosts riding the edge of sight. Light cavalry, some armored, some not, always moving. They pricked at the rear, then vanished. They loosed from far ridges, then slipped behind red beds and low hills. A Roman who chased them found only emptiness and the horrible knowledge that he had been lured away from his unit. Every evening, the same pattern repeated. The Romans would set camp in a square, ditching the perimeter, stacking shields outward. Then as the orange light bled from the sky, the Persians would appear. A ripple of horsemen, a sudden whistle of arrows, a quick flare of fire-tipped shafts into the baggage line. The Romans would shout, charge, form, and by the time they were ready the Persians were already gone. It was not a battle. It was a slow tightening. On the fifth day they reached a broad plain, baked so hard it rang under iron sandals. Scouts returned, Grim-faced Persian forces were visible, a head larger now, disciplined. Not Shapur's whole army yet, but enough to block the path and make Julian hesitate. The council met again under a cloth awning. That did little to soften the heat. Generals spoke in blunt terms. Supplies were dropping faster than expected. The men were exhausted. The enemy was choosing every moment of contact. If Shapur came in full strength, they would be fighting with empty bellies. One man, older and more cautious, said what everyone had been thinking but feared to speak. We should turn north now. We should reach the river again. The fleet is gone, but the water still gives us line and movement. Inland, we are blind. Julian's jaw tightened. He had never tolerated retreat, dressed as prudence, yet his eyes for the first time showed doubt. Then a guide stepped forward, one of the Arab scouts who had worked for Rome on the frontier for years. He spoke quickly, almost eagerly. There was a route, he said, a shortcut to the north. It would take them through fertile ground toward a place where grain and fodder might still be found. It would also bypass the Persian blocking force and bring them nearer to the northern Roman army. The generals stared at him. Some wanted to believe. Belief is a kind of food. Julian looked at the man for a long moment, weighing him like a coin. The guide swore by his gods, by his family, by everything a desperate man swears by. He said he had walked those paths as a boy. He knew the waterholes, he knew the villagers. Julian nodded. Then we take your road, orders snapped out. The army angled away from the plain into low, broken country. The sun lowered, and the air cooled only enough to remind men what comfort felt like. Their boots crunched over hard scrub. The columns stretched thinner in the uneven terrain, wagons bumping, soldiers cursing under their breath at first. It seemed to work. They found a small irrigation canal with a trickle of water. Men knelt and drank like animals. They reached an abandoned farmstead with stored grain buried under floor tiles. It wasn't much, but it was real, and it made the army feel less like it was walking inside a nightmare. Julian's confidence returned. He walked more among the infantry, speaking to them, praising endurance, promising that Shapur would soon be forced to fight. He believed it, or needed to. Then the land changed. The low scrub gave way to emptier ground. The irrigation ditches disappeared. The air grew harsher. The wind carried not the smell of plants, but of dust so fine it felt like sandpaper on the throat. Up by midday, they realized the guide's road was not a road at all. It was a dead stretch of scorched earth, a basin with no villages, no wells, no shade, a place the Persians had emptied months before, knowing exactly where a desperate army might be lured. The guide was gone. He had slipped away in the night, leaving nothing but footprints that the wind had half erased. A cold silence followed the discovery, not the silence of fear now, but the silence of men who understand betrayal with the clarity of thirst. They looked at their emperor. They looked at the empty horizon. The meaning of those burned ships came crashing back. Julian did not shout. He did not break. He simply stared north, as if he could peel open the earth with his eyes and find water hidden inside it. We march out, he said finally, voice hoarse. We march out now. The Persians chose that moment to strike. They had waited for the trap to close before showing the knife. From the ridges ahead, cavalry poured down in sheets. Arrows darkened the air. The Roman front ranks raised shields. The column tried to compress into a fighting shape, but the terrain worked against them. Wagons got stuck. Men shoved. Horses screamed as arrows bit into their flanks. Julian rode forward, shouting orders over the chaos, forcing cohorts to form a line along the highest ground they could seize. The legions did it the way they always had, dragging discipline out of panic by habit alone. They threw Pila, drove back the first wave, and held. But holding cost them. Every volley, every charge, every moment under that sunburnt strength they could not replace. By late afternoon the Persians withdrew again, leaving the Romans alive but shaken. But Isa lay in the dust, their mouths open as if still searching for water. The wounded were carried into the tight square of camp, their blood thick and dark in the heat. That night, no one sang. No one drank wine. There was no wine left. Julian sat in his tent with a bowl of water before him and did not touch it until every wounded man in camp had been given a share. It was a kind of gesture that makes soldiers love a commander. It was also a gesture that cannot refill an empty land. Outside, the sentries reported distant fires on the horizon, not Roman fires. Persian, many of them. Moving, closing. In the end, Darkly army listened to the faintest roll of drums and the occasional trumpet of elephants far away. Shapur was coming at last, and he was coming not to defend Ctesiphon anymore, but to cut Rome apart where Rome could not run. Julian lay down in his cloak near midnight, eyes opened, the dust still on his skin. Somewhere in the blackness ahead was a way out, or a final battle, he did not know which, and the dawn that would decide it was already creeping toward them. Retreat through Asher's morning did not arrive like hope. It arrived like a verdict. The Roman camp stirred under a sky already whitening with heat. Men rose stiff and silent, mouths gummy from thirst, eyes swollen from dust. They did not need scouts to tell them the truth. They could feel it in the way the air held its breath. They were being hunted now by an army that had finally gathered its full strength. Julian stood before the assembled officers with a face that had aged in a week. The philosopher emperor who once spoke of destiny now spoke of direction. The guide had betrayed them. The land had betrayed them. Only discipline remained loyal. "We go north," he said. "We find the river again. We fight only to live." It was a hard sentence for him to say. Some of his men looked down. Others looked relieved. No one laughed at the shift. Even pride can be drowned by hunger. They marched at first light, the column tightening, wagons pulled by animals that moved more from habit than strength. The rear guard was doubled. Cavalry patrolled the flanks like nervous wolves. Every man carried his shield as if it were a ceiling against the sky. Persia came with the sun. They did not charge in one grand wave. They did it the way a patient executioner does, one cut, then another, always where it hurt most. Horse archers appeared to the east, riding parallel, keeping distance. Their arrows began to fall in a steady rhythm, not a storm, just a constant sting. A soldier in the third cohort took one in the throat and fell without a sound. Another in the baggage line dropped as a shaft slid under his ribs. Roman shields rose, then lowered, then rose again. The enemy was making them tired of defending, making the defense feel pointless. Then a larger Persian body showed itself ahead. A line of cavalry and infantry positioned across low ground that the Romans needed. To cross, behind that line, taller shaped elephants again, and heavier cavalry glittering like a moving wall. A murmur of dread went through the column. They had expected harassment. This looked like a wedge meant to split them. Julian rode to the front, dust on his cloak, eyes hard. He had no choice but to punch through before the trap fully tightened. He raised his arm, and the trumpets answered with a harsh call that cut the air like a blade. The legions formed as they marched, shields locking, ranks deep. They advanced into the shallow valley in that old Roman way, slow enough to hold shape, fast enough to keep fear from blooming. Persian arrows thickened. Spears clattered against shields. The first Roman peeler flew and struck home, dragging riders from saddles. The Persians answered with a sudden forward surge, cavalry sweeping down the slope to meet the Romans' head dash on. It was the closest thing to a proper battle the retreat had seen, and for a moment Julian's army looked like itself again. Cohorts braced, the front rank took the shock. The second pressed in behind them, swords flashed, horses screamed. Persian noble cavalry crashed against Roman iron, and for a heartbeat it seemed the Persians might be pushed back, as they had been outside Ctesiphon. Then the elephants moved. They came not in a neat line this time, but in staggered bursts, their handlers using the uneven ground to hide their approach. One lumbered into the Roman left, scattering a cohort that had been hit by arrows all morning. Another pressed to the center, forcing the line to bend around its thick hide. Archers on their backs ranged shots down into exposed Roman faces. The valor turned into a furnace of panic. Julian galloped along the line, shouting, dragging men back into formation, throwing himself where it wavered. He had always believed that a commander's presence could be a weapon stronger than numbers. Today he used that belief like a spear. "Hold, you sons of Rome," he cried, voice raw. "Hold, and the gods will see you." They held. Barely. Roman skirmishers ran forward with torches and pitch, exactly as before. Fire blossomed under elephant eyes. The beasts recoiled, trumpeting, stamping, turning in confusion. One lurched sideways and crushed Persian cavalry. Another turned back into its own line, and the Persians scrambled to avoid being trampled by their own terror. The Romans, seeing the familiar chaos, regained their footing. They shoved forward hard, biting into the Persian center. For a few brutal minutes, the Persians fought to keep the valley blocked. Then they pulled away, giving ground rather than risking a locked melee that favored Roman infantry. The Romans had broken through, but victory tasted dry. They had lost men they couldn't replace. They had spent strength they couldn't recover, and the Persians, retreating in good order, had not been defeated. They had merely chosen another place to bleed Rome. By noon the retreat resumed. The column moved, leaving the bloody valley behind like a scar on the land. The injured limped, the dying were carried on shields, the dead were not buried. There was not time, there was not energy. The living walked with their eyes forward because looking back was unbearable. Late afternoon brought a cruel mirage, a glimmer on the horizon that seemed like water. Men quickened their pace, throats tightening with hope. When they reached it, it was only a salt flat, white and cracked, reflecting the sun like mockery. Some soldiers cursed aloud, others simply sagged, the last thread of optimism snapping in their chests. Julian rode among them in silence. He knew morale was a thing you could lose faster than food. He knew his men were asking themselves why they had marched here at all. They had defeated an army at Ctesiphon. They had stood at the gates of the Persian capital. Now they were stumbling through a wasteland, chased, dehydrated, and unsure if any road led out. He stopped near a cluster of legionaries who were sharing a mouthful of water between 5 men. Their hands shook as they passed the cup. They looked up, startled, expecting punishment for rationing too slowly. Julian only nodded at them. "You've carried Rome on your shoulders," he said quietly. "If this story matters to you, stay with me a little longer, and when you're able, leave a mark, like, subscribe. Tell me below what you think Julian should have done at Tessa. Your judgment is part of the memory we keep alive." The men didn't understand the future echo of those words, but they understood the tone. Their emperor was asking them to witness him, not just follow, and somehow that felt like respect. They straightened a little. They rose. They marched on. Near dusk, the Persians returned in a new shape. They did not strike the rear this time. They swept around the flanks and hit the column's middle, where the baggage and wounded moved slowest. A rain of arrows, then a fast cavalry rush, trying to carve out a chunk of the army like a butcher taking meat off a bone. The Romans reacted with grim efficiency. The middle cohorts turned outward, forming a rough ring. The baggage drivers grabbed spears. Even the wounded who could stand lifted shields. The Persians slashed at the ring, withdrew, slashed again. It became a spinning fight without center, dust and screams twisting together. Julian pushed cavalry into the breach, forcing the Persians to give distance. When they retreated, they took nothing but blood and time, yet that was enough. Every delay was a victory for Shapur. Every pause meant Roman hunger deepened, Roman water thinned, Roman feet slowed. Night fell with no rest. The Romans camped on a slight rise, digging ditches with hands that could barely close around shovels. Fires were small, hidden, because a large fire invited arrows. The men ate crushed grain mixed with river mud from canteens. They chewed as if chewing might turn into strength by desire alone. In the darkness, Julian met his senior officers again. The lamplight made their faces look like masks. Scouts reported that Chappa's main army was now within a day, perhaps less. They also reported something worse, that Persian forces were moving 2 positions ahead on the river line, aiming to block the Romans from reaching water. The officers looked at Julian. Some wanted to say it aloud. "If we don't reach the Tigris soon, we die." Julian stared at the map, then pushed it aside. "We march before dawn," he said. "We go hard. We go silent. If the Persians are closing the river, we take it from them." The general asked the question no one wanted to ask. "And if we can't?" Julian's eyes lifted slowly. "Then we make a wall of our bodies and sell our lives dearly." No one answered after that. They slept in fragments, waking to every rustle, every whisper of wind, every imagined hoofbeat. Sentries stood with bloodshot eyes, fingers on bowstrings that felt too heavy. Somewhere in the night, Persian horns sounded faintly, like wolves calling to each other across hills. Before dawn, they marched again. The sky was still black. When the first arrows came, they struck from both sides this time, as if the Persians had learned every Roman reflex and were now playing it like music. The column tightened. Shields rose. Men ran in short bursts to keep alignment. Julian could see the riverland ahead, a darker line at the horizon, a promise of water and movement. It looked close, too close to trust. As the sun broke, the Romans crested a low ridge. Below them, the Tigris shimmered. Salvation was there, wide and real. But between the ridge and the water, the Persians had already formed. a broad screen of cavalry and archers, and behind them heavier troops in reserve. They were not here to win a glorious battle, they were here to deny a thirsty army a river. The emperor, who never returned Julian, did not waste words on the ridge. He raised his right arm, and the whole Roman line seemed to inhale as one creature. Then he drove his horse forward, and the legions poured down after him, not with the joyous roar of conquest, but with the desperate force of men sprinting toward water while someone tries to kill them. Before they drink, the Persians loosed first. Arrows came in sheets, slicing the morning air. The front ranks buckled under the impact, shields rattling like hail on rooftops, but the Romans did not stop. They had learnt on this march that hesitation was the real enemy. They tightened their formation mid-run, closed gaps over fallen comrades, and smashed into the Persian screen like a battering ram striking a door. Steel met steel. The slope turned into a grinding press of bodies. Persian cavalry tried to pull back and lure the Romans into open ground, but thirst had erased patience. Roman infantry clung to the enemy like drowning men to driftwood, stabbing up at riders, yanking them down into the crutch. The Persian line bent, not from weakness, but from the sheer, hungry refusal of Rome to be denied. By late morning, they reached the river. Men dropped to their knees at the bank, scooping water with helmets, hands, anything. Some drank too fast and vomited. Some pressed their faces into the current like animals in a drought. The wounded crawled to it, leaving thin red trails in the mud. Behind them, the fight still raged, but the river had been reclaimed, and in that moment the army felt, for the first time in weeks, that survival might be possible. Julian stood on the bank and watched it with a look that was hard to read. Relief, yes, but also something darker, like a man who has already seen how near the edge he walked. He had crossed into Persia to conquer a king. Now he was fighting only to bring his men home alive. Shapur would not let him breathe long. That afternoon the Persians returned in heavier strength, probing for a place to cut the Romans away from the river again. Skirmishes flared on the flats. Roman archers answered. The legions reformed their marching square and began to move north. Along the Tigris, the retreat was now a race on the narrow strip between river and hostile interior. Watched on one side by Persian cavalry, on the other by the water they needed to live. 4 days. It repeated. March. Harass. Camp. Bleed. March. Again. The Romans called this kind of war shadow fighting. You never see the enemy fully. You only feel him. An arrow from a reed bed. A sudden rush over a low ridge. A blaze in your baggage line at night. The Persians were not trying to win a single decisive battle. They were trying to make every day a wound. Julian's army shrank inside itself, not in numbers alone, but in spirit. Every morning the same ritual unfolded. Men rose stiffly, looked at their faces reflected in the river, and saw strangers. Skin stretched tight over cheekbones, eyes rimmed red with dust, lips split by thirst. Yet the discipline held. The Roman machine, battered and starving, still moved with a stubborn rhythm learned over centuries. And Julian grew quieter. He had always talked to his officers the way philosophers talk to students, turning each decision into a debate with fate. Now he spoke less, listened more, and rode at the head of the column with a face like stone. Some soldiers whispered that the gods had abandoned him. Others whispered that he had been too bold to deserve their favor. But when he rode past, men still straightened their backs. Even in doubt, he was Rome's pulse. Then came the day near Samarra. The sun was a white hammer overhead. The army was stretched thin along a dusty track, river on the left, flashing with deceptive calm, low hills on the right, hiding whatever Persia wanted hidden. The scouts had reported unusual quiet since dawn. No arrows in the morning. No cavalry on the ridgelines. That quiet was more alarming than any attack. It felt like the pause before a blade falls midday. The trap revealed itself. Persian cavalry erupted from the hills on the right, fast and dense, aiming not for the rear this time but for the center, where Julian rode, where the command tent and standard bearers moved. At the same moment, a second Persian force appeared ahead, cutting across the road to halt the column's forward motion. The Romans were caught in a narrow corridor, river and hills alike, closing toward them. Trumpets screamed. Centurions roared orders. Cohorts turned outward, javelins ready. The Romans had done this dance a dozen times now, but never with the enemy. So bold, so close, so determined. Julian saw that cavalry surged toward him and did not retreat. In a decision that came from habit, pride, and the sharp instinct that a commander must be seen. He spurred forward to the threatened point. He wore no armor. Some say he had removed it earlier because of the heat. Some say he had been resting and rushed out without time. Either way, he rode into the storm with only a helmet and a cloak. The fighting became a knot of chaos. Persian horse archers swept by, loosing at point-blank range. Roman infantry lunged up at them, dragging riders down. The air was thick with dust and the smell of hot iron. Men shouted in Latin and Persian, their words swallowed by the clangor of shields and the trumpet of frightened horses. Julian was everywhere at once. He leaped from one point to another, rallying a wavering cohort, ordering a countercharge, pointing to a gap where Roman cavalry could strike. A soldier later said the emperor looked like a man possessed by the old gods, moving without fear. Because fear had no room left inside him, then it happened so quickly that no one could hold on to it. The exact moment a spear flew through the dust, it came from the Persian side at least that is what most believed. It struck Julian low in the right side, slipping between ribs. His body jerked. He nearly fell from the saddle. For a heartbeat, he tried to stay upright, clinging to the reins like a man clinging to the last thread of his own story. Then he slid down into Roman arms. The soldiers around him roared with a fury deeper than discipline. They pushed back hard, desperate now, not just to survive but to avenge. The Persians felt the surge and drew away, not defeated, but satisfied that their strike had landed where it mattered most. Julian was carried toward the riverbank, led on a shield under a thin patch of shade. Blood soaked his tunic, dark and steady. The physicians pressed cloth to the wound, tried to staunch it, tried to speak soothing lies. Julian waved them closer. "Did we win?" he whispered. No one wanted to answer. One general nodded anyway, because men do not die well without comfort. The emperor's eyes closed for a breath, then opened again, clearer than before. He did not cry out. He did not curse Persia. He did not beg any god for mercy. He spoke instead like the philosopher he had always been, as if death were another argument to make calmly. "I have lived," he said softly, "as I wished. Now I give back what was lent." By nightfall, he was gone. The army did not collapse instantly. Roman discipline was thicker than grief, but something in their core hollowed out. The man who had dragged them into Persia, who had burned their ships, who had stood at Ctesiphon dreaming of conquest, was now a body wrapped in a cloak, lying among common dead. They chose a new emperor in a hurry, because there was no other choice. Jovian, a senior officer but no grand conqueror, took the purple in the dark. His first act was not to fight, it was to save what remained. Shapur's main host closed in like a tide. The Romans were trapped deep in enemy land with dwindling supplies, a dead emperor, and too many wounded to sprint away. Jovian opened negotiations. The Persians were not gentle. They knew what they had in their hands. The price of survival was sharp and humiliating. Fortresses east of the Tigris were ceded. Cities that Rome had held for generations were handed over. Prisoners were returned. Pride was lowered in front of the world so that the legionaries could walk home with their lives. When the treaty was sealed, the Persians let the Romans go, not because they feared them, but because they had already won what mattered most. The Roman column limped north, thinner, quieter, carrying their dead emperor toward a homeland he would never see again, and behind them, Persia stood unbroken. Julian's war ended not at Ctesiphon, not even in the valley of that last fight, but in the long shadow between ambition and reality. He had beaten a Persian field army at the gates of a capital, yet lost the campaign to distance, hunger, and the patient cruelty of an enemy who understood time better than glory. Even in Rome, where memories are shaped like coins, one side scarred on the other his and did not settle cleanly. Some claimed a Persian warrior killed him. Some whispered darker things, that a Roman spear found him in the dust, thrown by a soldier who blamed him for the march into hell. No one ever proved it, no one ever could. The desert keeps its secrets. What remained certain was this: the emperor who went east dreaming of a new Trajan never returned. And as the Tigris flowed on, carrying away blood and arrows alike, it seemed to murmur one last question into the ruins of that campaign. Was Julian's death the price of hubris, or the cost of Rome daring to challenge Persia at all? The answer, like the spear that struck him, vanished into the dust.